Hi class. From 1600 to 1750, trade has continued to expand and facilitated global trade networks that's tying far reaches into the world together. So what's being traded? Sugar, spice, silk, porcelain, cotton from India, tobacco from the Americas, and we're going to see a lot of enthusiasm for investment opportunities and stimulated growth, but this is going to come at a financial risk. I think the textbook talks a little bit about a financial downturn in England in the 1700s, but it's going to be silver that strengthens the hands of European trade. How do Europeans get so wealthy? It's going to be silver. They know where to find it. They know who wants it. So competition during this time is going to lead to some bitter conflicts and wars between nations. This economic world is going to strengthen some empires, but it's also going to weaken others. So let's take a look at that. Class, I love this map. The 17th and 18th centuries were again the first centuries of true global commerce. Silver, I'm going to say it again, it's the one item that's being traded and used all over the world. If you look at this map carefully, you can trace the flows of silver from the Americas all around the globe and then identify the commodities that silver was exchanged for. But again, it's the European nations who are using the silver to their advantage. This really continued to fuel European states' territorial ambitions and colonial attempts. They want the silver, they want the resources. And ultimately, this outcome of this, the new global trading or transoceanic trade, as I believe how the textbook refers to it, first is going to affect mercantile groups. We're going to talk about them in just a moment. And we're also going to see the deepening connections across the different economic regions are going to increase and challenge rulers, and it's going to alter the lives of common people. And later, this economic integration is going to weaken some of the rulers that I mentioned and strengthen others. So let's take a minute and look at some of these important items of commerce on this map. I think it's important. Furs from North America and Siberia is going to develop a strong market. We'll talk about that. Chocolate, we've already talked about chocolate from the Americas. It's going to drive sugar, and then later on tobacco. But slave trading, class, is going to prove to be one of the most devastating outcomes of this global market. We're going to see the largest forced migration in world history take place. Over 11 million, I think it's 12 million now, men, women, and children from Africa will be captured, sold, and then transported to the New World. I love these two pictures. The first one is Turkish men drinking coffee at a banquet, and the second is a coffee house in England. Starbucks for the 16th century, right? We love our coffee. Coffee and tobacco, class, became an extremely important and hot commodity. Starting in the late 15th centuries, by the Ottoman Empire, these coffee houses spread through Europe and England by the 1650s. Listen, by 1700, there were over 500 coffee houses in the city of London alone. My goodness. So there's a little religious opposition at first, but soon even priests and Muslim imams were partakers of these products. And we all drink coffee, right? And what's going to come out of these coffee houses is a new public sphere. What happens, class, when you get groups of people together smoking and drinking? Well, we're going to see. Spain first brought chocolate back to Europe. They spent 100 years trying to keep it a secret, but it's just too good to keep a secret, right? And what's interesting to me, class, is that the Aztecs drank chocolate as a spicy drink, not a sweet drink. But we like sugar, don't we? And I thought you'd find this slide amusing. All this influx of New World sugar is going to sweeten European diets. Again, who's watching this video that hasn't had sugar today, right? But it's also going to lead to the spread of a new affliction, tooth decay. Now, tooth pulling became a public form of entertainment. Hygiene in general at the time was poor, but this tooth pulling became very popular. I'm not sure I would find that very entertaining, but... So what is mercantilism? I mentioned this is sort of the driving force behind this global trade. Mercantilism is an important term for you, class. What it does is it presumes the world's wealth is fixed and that it is okay for one country's wealth to be at the expense of another's. Okay, colonies are going to exist only to enrich and generate wealth for the motherland. Usually, you're even forbidden to trade with mother's competitions. This ideology is going to last into the 20th century. Remember the lucrative mining ventures of the Spanish and the Portuguese, all of this gold and silver coming out of the New World into Europe. This is going to lead other European powers to seek similar opportunities in the 17th century. It's working for Spain and Portugal, why not us? It's going to lead to some piracy as well. If England or France couldn't get there fast enough, hey, we'll just seize the Spanish ships off the coast for ourselves. It's going to lead to a lot of conflicts between the nations and ultimately a couple of wars that we'll see a little bit later. These ventures in Americas led Europeans to create something called charter companies in an attempt to colonize the New World, primarily North America and parts of the Caribbean. The Dutch West India Company was one, but many other charter companies will be created to start these ventures, these mercantilistic ventures in the New World. Unfortunately, many of those will end up in bankruptcy. Now, these latecomers to the party, to colonizing the New World, did not discover the mineral wealth that the Spanish and the Portuguese had discovered, right? They are going to North America. They're going to exploit the fertile land and sort of become an agrarian type nation. They're going to raise cash crops instead of minerals, such as sugarcane, tobacco, indigo, rice, and those kinds of things. Now, they had to negotiate with the people who were there, the Native Americans, but usually it was more a system of oppression and robbery against the Native Americans to establish their colonies rather than being able to get along. But we'll talk about that in just a minute. Again, things like those crops and fur trade is going to be important, but we're going to see a lot of financial gain, sadly, class, will be made in slave trading. I thought this was an interesting map of the colonies. France, England, and Spain are laying claim to much of North America, and you can see what they covered in this time frame. Now, where each of these colony powers were the strongest before the outbreak of the 7-Year War in 1756, preceding the American Revolutionary War, take a look at where they're strongest. Take a look at where their stronghold is. Take a look at the empire who's gaining most of the North American territory, and then we'll talk about who lost most of the territory in the 1760s. So you can imagine how this affected the Native Indians, this explosion of occupation in their territory by Spain, France, England. And so we're going to take a look at the outcome of that. This is a late 16th century drawing by John White, an early English pioneer settler on the Roanoke Island, which actually was a failed attempt at colonizing by England off the coast of North Carolina. And it's depicting an Indian village of Secoton in eastern Virginia. Now, take a look at that in contrast to the great empires that Spain conquered in the Valley of Mexico and the Andes Indians. These guys are different. These woodland Indians, class, they are a settled society. They generally lived in small villages that were politically autonomous entities from other villages. They did have trading routes between Indian groups. But the Aztecs and the Incas were just a complex, bureaucratic, religious society, very wealthy. And the woodland Indians on the eastern coast of the U.S. today, they lived in longhouses. They were an agrarian society and relatively peaceful. Not the idea that you're going to have when you take a look at maybe the Western Plains Indians of the Comanches. These guys were a little different. So the French. The French is going to come to the New World, and their interest is going to lie in the Northern Passage, which takes them to the St. Lawrence River of the Great Lakes. Samuel de Champlain is going to found the colony of New France in this river valley region. There's going to be some French missionaries attempting to convert the natives to Catholicism, but the main important reason why France is here is going to be over furs. The French settlers called Coureurs de Bois, they come in, they're going to buy beaver skins harvested by the natives. And it's really going to create a link between the groups. It's going to lead to some ties that you're not going to see between other European groups and natives. We're going to talk a little bit about the English experience, but the French experience in the New World is different. There were marital relations between the French and native Indians. It's going to give rise to sort of a biracial generation who link the two peoples. Also, the English is going to hug the coast, as we see, but France is going to go deep into North America, down the Mississippi, all without conquest. How did they do this? They did this, again, with intermarriages, relationship building. They're going to stay. They're going to work with the indigenous. They're not going to try to take over the indigenous, but work with them. Also, I think one thing that affected the relationship between France and the Native Americans is that they came in smaller numbers than the English. All in all, they're always going to have a better relationship with the Native Americans, and we'll see that play out many, many times. And this is an interesting drawing to me. It just shows that France and Northern America, really no commodity ever was more important for them than the beaver skins. This fur trade is going to determine the character of the colonial regime in North America for France. And for Native Americans, it offered access to European goods, some good for the Native Americans, but many of these goods are not going to be a positive outcome for the Native Americans. The Native Americans are affected by disease as well from the French coming in and then later the English. But one of the outcomes, the unintended consequences really of this fur trade is going to be overhunting. Overhunting class is going to deplete resources. It's almost going to drive beavers to the point of extinction. And then it's going to lead to some intertribal conflicts over territory and resources. Now, let's talk a minute about the English. England's colonists establish an expansive agrarian settlement along the Atlantic seaboard of North America, always hugging the coastline. Now, there were several stops and starts at their attempts to colonize, but they're finally going to end up in Jamestown in the Virginia colony. And from there, we do see persecuted religious groups are going to settle in North England, the North and New England region, and that kind of thing. But class, the attempts to colonize the New World that will later become the United States started over money. They're looking for ventures to support the mercantilistic ideology. Yes, a lot of people say, well, the United States was started on, religious, people looking for religious freedoms. That is true to a degree for the northern New England colonies. But the first colonists came to the New World for money and for greed. So the Virginia Company was established. It was the first charter company, and it was established again using the mercantilistic ideology. It was not good for the Native Americans. Relations are always going to be much more confrontational with the English than with the French or the Dutch. It's going to start out a little bit better than it ended. The first generation of Native Americans who encountered the new colonists, they had to work something out. The English couldn't have survived without their help. But this second generation is not going to work out well. The English always had a separate sphere from the natives. They never acted like Spain or France. They never intermarried. And the English developed a strictly an agricultural economy over cash crops. Like one of the first ones was tobacco. And one of the exceptions to the rule of English never marrying Native Americans is Rolfe was the first tobacco plantation owner, and he married Pocahontas. Not John Smith, but Rolfe. Now, so in the need for an agricultural economy, the need is land. Who has the land? The Native Americans have the land. So what's going to happen is a lot of oppression of the Native Americans, and ultimately war between the colonists and the Indians are going to be imminent over this press for the colonists to take over land and also for resources. The English just pushed on, building farms and plantations and cities, and as a result, they're going to need laborers. Indentured servants didn't work out very well. No one wanted to work in tobacco. It's a hard crop to work. No one wanted to work in rice. That was one of the other crash crops. You work in water. Indigo crops, horrible. So no one wanted to work there willingly. So slavery began to creep in the colonies from the very beginning. The Dutch brought the first Africans, and class, listen to this statistic, by 1700, 250,000 Europeans lived in the English mainland in North America, in the colonies, but along with 150,000 African slaves. So by 1700, things are really beginning to shift. They also have colonies in the Caribbean, and they're going to use the Portuguese sugarcane plantation model. Remember, we talked briefly, Portuguese settled off the coast of Africa, developed some sugarcane plantations, and this is going to extend into the English and French possessions and the Caribbean. The most populous English colony was Barbados. Now, because of the decimation of the Native American population, also the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean and South America, African slaves will make up the vast majority of the population on these islands and the Atlantic ports. Sugar was the preeminent agricultural export, guys, from the New World for centuries. And owners of these sugarcane plantations really relied exclusively on African slavery to produce the sugar. Labor in these fields are harsh. Slaves worked from sun up to sundown. It was a killing crop, so it wasn't a pleasant lifestyle for the slaves who ended up in the Caribbean. We're going to conclude with this slide, and I'll pick back up with more about the slave trade in just a moment.